Hello, I'm John Frank, and my guest today is no stranger when it comes to understanding the impact of technology on democracy. I'm delighted to welcome former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Can you talk to us about some of the most significant changes in the world of international relations and diplomacy that you've seen in recent years?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and there have been a lot of changes. I think that the most significant ones are basically that there are a lot more players in it. The system is based on the nation state, but all of a sudden we have a lot of non-state actors. And they are playing a larger and larger role. Microsoft is a non-state actor, and how the state and non-state actors relate to each other, I think, is very important. The other is, in fact, the role of technology, which is the newest player in everything in terms of the way it both connects and disconnects people.
Over the past decade, technology has been often cited as an enabler for democracy, but in the recent few years we've also seen events that would demonstrate that the use of technology can create distrust and tear at some of the fabric of democracy. Are the biggest threats to democracy behind us?
No, I think partially, and to just provide a little bit more context for that, democracy needs information. It is based on the fact that there is a relationship between the people and their leaders that is, and information is required in order for the people to know what the leaders are doing, and the leaders need to know what the people want, and it's just absolutely essential. So when there was all of a sudden technology, and I have been very involved in democracy support, everybody thought, aha, this is going to be perfect because it's a way to provide information. The problem is that it has disaggregated voices, and people get their information in totally different ways. And we have now recently been hearing more and more about that some of the things that are put into the system are just wrong or threatening or counterproductive. So I don't think the story is over, and I think as there are questions about how technology is controlled, is information open and free, what responsibilities do the non-state actors have in terms of what gets into the system. So I think there are more and more questions because this is entirely new, and a lot of people are involved in it. It's not just a matter that there's a controlling authority, like a king or something, that can control everything. So this is not over.
In recent years, we've seen a rise in state-sponsored cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns and the like. What are your thoughts about how we can kind of control the cyber attacks by state-sponsored entities and try to bring more order to this?
I think that is the major question in terms of so many things. I was asked to do a new strategic concept for NATO and what really constituted an Article 5 attack. And one of the issues that we were dealing with, and this was now 10 years ago, was what had happened in Estonia. And that as a result of attacks on banks and various things, where did it come from? And was it an Article 5? And which it requires people to come to the defense of a country that's been attacked. And it was just difficult at that time to make such a decision because you didn't know the genesis of it. So I think that what is important and that has evolved is that we now are able, in many cases, to figure out where the attack began. And so there have to be, I think, some rules where we have made rules in terms of protecting ourselves from nuclear weapons. I do think that there are going to have to be some rules in terms of cyber, which can bring down a country or create, well, we were talking about democracies also in terms of mucking around in the elections, but can bring down a system in many ways. So I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be resolved.
In a time of stark polarization between the U.S. and Russia and tense relations with China, how can we make progress on cyber diplomacy, ensuring the integrity of democratic processes?
I think it's a very hard question because the Russians seem to be acting in a way that they see democracy as their enemy, and have a sustained campaign to undermine the very essence of democracy, which I said is information, by inputting things that are wrong. And they are trying to undermine the democracies in X country and then divide those countries among themselves and then divide them from America. So I think it is very hard. I think it is going to necessitate naming and shaming and then using the tools that we have in order to deal with it, which are how to use sanctions and how to get other countries to help. It's not something that the United States can do all by itself. And so there are many discussions in terms of how we deal with cyber attacks. And then there is one that is very difficult, I think, to answer. Do we go on a cyber offensive? It doesn't seem kind of the thing that we would do, but it is a question about how one deals if you are basically if your system is being attacked. And one does have that feeling that they are bound kind of on a mission to undermine democracy.
Going back to your study for NATO, well, in 2016, NATO elevated cyberspace to one of the military domains. What role do you see for NATO when it comes to reducing the risk of cyber conflict?
I see it an important role. First of all, it does need to keep up with the times. I think the part that was interesting in 2009 when we were doing this was that NATO was dealing with what people said were out-of-area conflict, which meant that it wasn't nation states that were NATO members that were being attacked, but it was what was going on in Afghanistan and the Balkans, and beginning to see new threats. I think that we now know that space is actually not out of area, it's everything. And then the part that I think NATO needs to really take advantage of is the relationships of trust that exist among the NATO members in terms of sharing intelligence and operating together. But it's going to be an effort because they have had to go back to some of their basics, which is like moving some troops into Central and Eastern Europe and dealing with exercises on the ground by the Russians. And so it's going to take support and it's going to take a sense by the countries themselves to push NATO into recognizing that this is the future and that it is part of collective security.